The alarm did not sound like an alarm, it sounded like a scream. I was standing in the recovery ward when the lights turned red, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved, because nobody wanted to believe what the sound meant. My name is Laura Bennett, and on that day I was a medical liaison aboard the hospital ship Compassion's Reach, the only fully neutral vessel in this entire sector of space. We treated everyone: soldiers, refugees, children, even the wounded from empires that hated each other. We were untouchable. That was the whole point of us. Until the moment we were not. I remember the exact taste of the coffee still in my mouth, bitter and too hot, when the ship's proximity sensors screamed that 7 warships had dropped out of slipspace less than 200 kilometers from our hull. 7 warships, with no warning beacon, no diplomatic hail, nothing but raw engine heat blooming against the dark like something opening its eyes. I was 29 years old. I had never seen a warship up close in my life. Nobody my age had. That was the strange peace we had all grown up inside of. A peace built on a treaty, signed 107 years before I was born. Back when humanity fought a war so terrible that every species in this part of the galaxy still lowered their voices when they spoke about it. We were the quiet species now, the healers. The ones who kept their promises. I had been taught, since I was a child, that humanity had chosen a different path, and that the old stories about us were exaggerated, softened by time, turned into myths that scared children at bedtime, and nothing more. I did not know yet how wrong that belief was about to prove. "Laura, get to the bridge liaison deck," said Kevin Marsh, my supervising officer, a broad-shouldered man with steady hands and a voice that never seemed to rise even in emergencies. He was already moving, already pale. Now. I ran. The corridors of Compassion's Reach were built wide enough for stretchers, for medical drones, for wheelchairs and walking wounded, and I had run down them 100 times before, but never like this, never with my heart slamming against my ribs and every patient's face turning toward me as I passed, silently asking what was happening, and me having no answer for any of them. When I reached the bridge liaison deck, the main viewport showed them clearly: 7 ships, painted in the deep violet and gold of the Dominion fleet, arranged in a slow, deliberate formation around us, the kind of formation you use to surround something, not to greet it. The Dominion. Our patients that week were largely Dominion citizens, refugees fleeing a civil uprising on one of their outer worlds. We had taken in over 300 of them just 4 days earlier, families mostly, their homes burned in fighting between 2 rival factions inside their own empire. We had no side in that conflict. We never took sides. That was the law, older than any of us, written into the threshold accords in careful, unbreakable language. A hospital ship does not choose a side. A hospital ship is protected by all sides. That was the whole reason such ships could exist at all. Captain Nathan Cole stood at the center console, his jaw tight, watching the same viewport I was watching. He was not a soldier. None of us were soldiers. He was a career humanitarian officer who had spent 11 years keeping this ship running, keeping people alive, keeping promises. I had never once heard him raise his voice. "Hail them," he said quietly. "Full diplomatic channel. Identify us under accord protection. Repeat our registry number. Repeat our neutral status." The channel opened. Static hissed for a moment, and then a voice filled the bridge, cold and flat, speaking through a translation filter that stripped away any warmth the original words might have carried. "This is Fleet Marshal Rescavai, of the Dominion 3rd Battle Group. You are harboring enemies of the Dominion state. You will surrender all patients transferred to your vessel within the last cycle, or we will consider your ship to be an active support of insurgent forces." I felt the blood leave my face. Every person on that bridge understood exactly what those words meant, because every person on that bridge had spent their entire career believing such words could never be spoken to us. The refugees below, the mothers, the children, the elderly, they were not insurgents, they were patients. They were people who had run from violence and found the one place in the galaxy that was supposed to be safe. "Fleet Marshal," Captain Cole said, and his voice remained level, even though I could see his hand tighten on the edge of the console. "This vessel operates under the Threshold Accords, ratified by your own government 107 years ago. We do not surrender patients to any military force, under any circumstance. regardless of their origin or alleged status. This is not a matter of choice. It is not a matter of politics. It is law, and it is law your empire agreed to. There was a pause, a long one, long enough that I started to hope, foolishly, that the fleet marshal was reconsidering, that somewhere in that pause a cooler mind was stepping in, that this would end the way every tense moment in my quiet life had always ended, with words, with patience, with nothing worse than raised voices. "You have 3 minutes," the voice said instead. "Then we will take what we came for." The channel closed. Nobody spoke for a moment. I looked around the bridge and saw the same expression on every face, a kind of dawning horror. The sensation of watching a wall you always assumed was solid begin to crack in front of your eyes. "They cannot be serious," whispered Emma Whitfield, the ship's communications officer, a woman barely older than me, who I had shared meals with 100 times, who kept a photo of her sister's children pinned above her console. "They signed the accords. Their own ancestors signed it. Nobody breaks the accords. Nobody has broken the accords in 100 years. Get the patients moved to the inner decks," Captain Cole said, ignoring her question because there was no good answer to it. "All of them. Refugees first. Move the children into the shielded ward. Do it now." I did not wait to be told twice. I ran. The ward where we had housed the refugee families was 3 decks down, and by the time I arrived, the medical staff there had already sensed that something was wrong. Alarms were still bleeding red light across every wall. A Dominion woman named Vessa, an older refugee who had lost her husband in the uprising just weeks before, grabbed my arm as I passed, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond confusion, a fear that came from recognizing danger before anyone had explained it to her. "They are here for us," she said, in halting standard, the trade language most species use to speak with humans. "They think we are with the rebels. We are not. We are only farmers. Please." "Nobody is taking you anywhere," I told her, and I meant it, even though I had no idea, standing there, whether that promise was one I could actually keep. "We are moving everyone to a safer section of the ship. Please help me get the children together." We worked fast. Kevin Marsh appeared with 2 medical drones and began organizing the evacuation route, calm and methodical, even as the ship's internal lighting flickered with each new alarm cycle. I lost count of how many families I helped move, how many hands I held, how many frightened faces I tried to reassure with words I did not fully believe myself. 3 minutes. That was what the fleet marshal had given us. 3 minutes to move over 300 people through a ship never designed for a crisis like this. A ship built for healing, not for hiding anyone from anything. I checked the ship's chronometer on the wall as I guided the last family through the bulkhead door into the inner shielded ward. 40 seconds left. "Move, move," Kevin was shouting now, his calm voice finally cracking under the weight of what was coming. "Everybody inside, now. Seal the door behind the last group." I turned back for one final sweep of the corridor, making sure nobody had been left behind, and that was when I saw him. A boy, maybe 7 years old, sitting alone against the far wall, clutching a small stuffed animal, tears streaming silently down his face, too frightened to move, too small to understand why the adults around him were suddenly running. "Hey," I said, dropping to my knees in front of him, keeping my voice as soft and steady as I could manage, despite the alarms screaming around us. "What's your name?" "Toma," he whispered. "Toma, I need you to come with me right now, okay? Can you do that?" He nodded, and I scooped him up, his small arms wrapping around my neck with a grip so tight it almost hurt, and I ran, my boots pounding against the deck plating, my lungs burning, the alarm counting down somewhere in the walls around us. 10 seconds! 9! 8! I made it through the bulkhead door with 3 seconds to spare, and Kevin sealed it behind me with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed through the entire inner ward like a held breath finally released. I set Toma down beside a woman I assumed was his mother, who pulled him into her arms with a sob of relief, and for one moment, just one moment, I allowed myself to believe that we had done enough, that the shielded ward would hold, that the fleet marshal's threat had been exactly that, a threat, and nothing more. Then the entire ship shuddered, a deep, terrible groan of metal that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears, and every light in the ward went out at once. For a moment, there was only darkness, and the sound of 300 people trying not to scream, and somewhere far above us, the sound of Compassion's reach beginning to die. Emergency lighting flickered on a few seconds later, dim amber strips along the floor that gave the ward the look of a place already half abandoned. Somewhere above us I could hear the groan of stressed metal, the distant thud of impacts against the outer hull, sounds I had only ever heard described in old history recordings, never lived through myself. "Report," Kevin Marsh said into his comm unit, his voice tight, and for a moment there was only static in reply. Then Captain Cole's voice came through, breathless, strained in a way I had never heard from him before. "They opened fire on our outer shield array. Direct hit. We are still broadcasting our registry beacon. They know exactly what ship this is, and they fired anyway. I repeat, they fired on a marked hospital vessel." Nobody in that ward moved for a long moment. Even the children seemed to understand, in whatever way children understand things too large for words, that something in the universe had just changed shape. Emma Whitfield's voice cut through next, thinner now, edged with something between disbelief and fear. "Captain, our outer hull integrity is at 60% and falling. Weapons systems detected. They are charging a second volley. Get every non-essential crew member into the shielded wards," Captain Cole ordered. "Laura, Kevin, I need you to keep those patients calm and contained. Do not let anyone try to leave the shielded section, not for any reason." I looked around the ward at the faces staring back at me, Vesa holding tightly to another refugee's hand, Toma still clinging to his mother, an elderly Dominion man near the far wall, praying quietly in a language I did not recognize, and I understood, in that moment, that my job was no longer simply medical. It was to be the calm voice in a room full of people who had every reason to be terrified. "Listen to me," I said, raising my voice just enough to be heard over the ambient hum of failing systems. "This ward was built to withstand direct hull breaches. We are as safe here as anywhere on this ship. I need everyone to stay seated, stay together, and trust that our crew is doing everything possible to protect you." It was not entirely true. I did not know if the ward could withstand what was coming. But a lie that keeps 300 people from panicking in a sealed room is sometimes the only mercy available. The second volley struck 4 minutes later. I felt it before I heard it, a violent lurch that threw half the room off their feet, followed by a deep, tearing groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dust rained down from a ceiling vent. Somewhere down the corridor outside the sealed bulkhead, I heard something collapse. "Kevin," I said, my voice shaking now despite everything I had told myself about staying calm. "How bad is it?" He was staring at a small diagnostic panel built into the bulkhead wall, one of the few instruments still functioning inside our sealed section. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Deck 7 is gone," he said quietly. That was the main surgical theater. "And Deck 9, that was the pediatric recovery wing." I thought of every colleague I had worked beside in those wards, every patient I had helped settle into recovery just that morning, and something in my chest went cold and hollow, in a way I had never felt before. "Were they evacuated?" I asked, already knowing, somehow, what the answer would be. Kevin did not answer. He did not have to. The ship shuddered again, smaller this time, and Captain Cole's voice returned over the comm, quieter now, stripped of the calm authority it had carried only minutes earlier. "All hands, this is the captain. We have lost primary power to decks 6 through 11. Casualties are significant. I am transmitting a final distress signal to Sol Relay before our long-range array is destroyed. If anyone can hear this beyond our own crew, know that Compassion's reach was struck without provocation, without warning, in direct violation of the Threshold Accords, while sheltering civilian refugees under full diplomatic protection." His voice caught, just slightly, on the next words. "We did not fire a single shot. We were never able to. This ship carries no weapons. It never has. That was the entire point of what we were." The comm channel cut to static. I looked at Kevin, and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to say that would not have sounded foolish against the sound of our ship dying around us. It was Vesa who broke the silence, rising unsteadily to her feet, her hand still tightly holding her nephew's shoulder. "This ship saved my family," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It saved hundreds of families. Why would anyone do this?" I did not have an answer for her. I still do not. Not really. Not one that makes any true sense. There are explanations, political ones, strategic ones, cold calculations about insurgent leadership hiding among refugee populations, but none of them explain the choice to fire on an unarmed hospital that had broadcast its identity clearly from the very first second of contact. The third volley did not come as a distant tremor. It came as a wall of sound and force that threw every one of us to the floor at once. An explosion somewhere close, close enough that the sealed bulkhead door bowed inward with a horrible metallic scream. Emergency lighting failed completely. In the total darkness that followed, I heard children crying, adults calling out names, the distant hiss of a ruptured atmospheric line somewhere beyond the ward. I do not remember deciding to move. I only remember finding myself crawling across the tilted deck, plating toward the sound of a child's cry, my hands finding small shoulders in the dark, pulling him against me the way I had pulled Toma to safety less than 10 minutes earlier, whispering that everything would be all right, even though I no longer believed it myself. A secondary emergency light flickered weakly to life along the far wall, just enough to see by. The ward around me looked like something out of a nightmare. Patients and refugees scattered across a floor now sloped at an unnatural angle, dust and debris hanging in the recycled air, a thin haze of smoke curling from somewhere near the ruptured bulkhead seam. Kevin was on his feet again, moving through the wreckage with a medical drone at his side, checking on the injured, his composure returning, even as blood ran freely from a cut above his eyebrow. "Laura," he called out, "help me get everyone away from the breach point. If that seal fails completely, we lose atmosphere in this whole section." I did not think. I moved. I do not know how long we spent in that darkness, pulling people away from the failing bulkhead, holding pressure against wounds with strips of torn medical gowns, telling children stories about nothing at all, just to keep their minds away from the sound of the ship groaning around them. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the next person who needed help, and the next, and the next. At some point, I found myself kneeling beside an elderly Dominion woman whose leg had been crushed beneath a fallen support beam, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering with the particular exhausted calm that comes just before someone loses consciousness from shock. I did not know her name. I never learned it. I only remember her hand finding mine in the dark, gripping it with surprising strength, and her whispering something in her own language that I could not translate, but that I understood anyway, in the way you understand fear and gratitude, even across the widest gaps of language and culture. I stayed with her until a medical drone reached us, stabilizing her leg, injecting something that eased her breathing, and only then did I allow myself to sit back against the sloped wall and breathe, my hands shaking uncontrollably, blood, hers or someone else's, drying on my palms. That was when Emma's voice crackled weakly over a handheld emergency comm unit Kevin had managed to power on using a backup cell. "Laura, Kevin, if you can hear this, the Dominion fleet has stopped firing. I don't know why. Their ships are holding position, not advancing, not retreating. Captain Cole is alive. He's in the auxiliary control room. We're trying to hold what's left of the ship together." "What about the distress signal?" Kevin asked, his voice hoarse. There was a pause, filled with static, before Emma answered. "It went out. Before we lost the long-range array, it went out." Soul Relay confirmed receipt. I do not know why that single sentence affected me the way it did, kneeling there in the dark, surrounded by wounded strangers and children too frightened to cry anymore, but something in my chest loosened, just slightly, at the idea that somewhere, impossibly far away, someone now knew what had happened here. That we were not simply going to disappear into silence, forgotten, another quiet tragedy, in a galaxy that had grown used to looking away from such things. I did not yet understand what that single transmission would set into motion. None of us did. We were simply trying to survive the next hour, then the next, counting the wounded, rationing what little medical supplies remained accessible, listening to the ship creak and groan around us like something alive and dying at the same time. It was hours later, though it felt like days, when Kevin finally managed to get the ward's internal display working long enough to show a fragment of the Dominion fleet's formation outside. The 7 warships remained exactly where they had been, motionless, silent, their weapons no longer firing but their presence still a threat, hanging over what remained of our broken ship. "Why did they stop?" I asked, more to myself than to anyone else. Kevin did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard from him before, something between exhaustion and a kind of grim certainty. "I think," he said slowly, "they got exactly what they wanted, and now they're waiting to see what comes next." I did not understand what he meant. Not fully, not then. I only understood that the ship I had trusted with my life for 3 years was now a broken shell drifting in the dark, that colleagues I had shared meals with were gone, that hundreds of frightened refugees were now trapped in a slowly failing shelter, with no way to reach the outside world, and that somewhere, unimaginably far away, a message had reached Earth, carrying the truth of what had happened here. I did not know it yet, but that single message was already beginning to change everything. I woke up in a recovery bed I did not remember reaching, my ribs wrapped tightly, a dull ache pulsing through my skull with every heartbeat. For a moment I did not know where I was, and then the memory returned all at once. The alarms, the darkness, the woman whose hand had gripped mine so tightly, and I sat up too quickly, gasping at the pain that shot through my side. "Easy," said a familiar voice. Kevin was sitting in a chair beside my bed, a bandage over his eyebrow, dark circles under his eyes, that told me he had not slept since the attack. "You collapsed about 6 hours ago. Exhaustion mostly, plus a couple of cracked ribs from when the deck plating shifted under you. You're going to be fine." 6 hours, I repeated, my voice raw. "How long has it been since it happened?" "Almost 3 days, Kevin said quietly. 3 days. I tried to sit with that number, tried to understand how so much time could have passed while I lay unconscious, while the rest of the ward carried the weight of survival without me. "The refugees," I said, "Toma, and his mother, and—" "They're alive," Kevin said quickly, seeing the fear rising in my face. "Most of them. We lost 11 people in the shielded ward when the bulkhead partially failed before the emergency seal engaged, and we lost far more than that outside the ward, in the decks that took direct hits. But Toma is fine. He's been asking about you every day." I closed my eyes, allowing myself one small breath of relief amid everything else, and then I asked the question I had been almost afraid to ask. "What about the Dominion fleet? Are they still out there?" Kevin's expression shifted, something complicated passing behind his tired eyes. "They pulled back 2 days ago," he said, "no explanation given, just turned and left, the same way they arrived, without a word." That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the quiet before something worse. "Why would they just leave?" I asked. "I don't know," Kevin admitted, "but Captain Cole thinks it might have something to do with what happened after our distress signal reached Sol Relay." He reached over and activated a small display screen mounted beside my bed, angling it so I could see. What appeared on the screen was a recorded broadcast, several days old now, originating from Earth's Central Information Network, the kind of broadcast meant for public consumption across the entire galaxy, translated automatically into dozens of languages scrolling beneath the speaker's face. The speaker was a woman I did not recognize, dressed in the formal gray uniform of Earth's Unified Council, her expression carved from something that looked very much like controlled fury. "3 days ago," the woman said, her voice steady and clear, "the hospital vessel, Compassion's Reach, operating under full protection of the Threshold Accords, was attacked, without warning or provocation, by a battle group of the Dominion Third Fleet. This vessel carried no weapons. It carried no military personnel. It carried the sick, the wounded, and refugees fleeing violence, including citizens of the Dominion itself." She paused, and even through the recording, even across the distance of days and light years, I felt the weight of what she said next settle over the room like a physical thing. "For 107 years, humanity has honored the peace established after the First Contact War. We have kept every promise made under that treaty. We have asked for nothing beyond what every other signatory species has received. That peace was never weakness. It was a choice, made and remade every single day, by a species that understood exactly what the alternative would cost." I glanced at Kevin. He was watching the screen with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between grim satisfaction and something closer to dread. "That choice," the woman continued, "has now been broken, not by us, but against us. The Dominion government has offered no formal explanation, no apology, and no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Under the terms of the Threshold Accords, an attack against a protected medical vessel constitutes a direct violation of galactic law, and under our own constitutional charter, such a violation authorizes immediate and appropriate response. The recording ended there, cutting to a slate bearing Earth's official seal. I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to understand the full weight of what I had just heard. "They're not just protesting this," I said slowly. "They're preparing to respond." "That's what Captain Cole believes," Kevin said. "And it would explain why the Dominion fleet withdrew so suddenly. Word must have reached them about how Earth was reacting. I don't think they expected this." "What did they expect?" I asked. Kevin was quiet for a moment before answering. "I think," he said carefully, "they expected exactly what everyone else in this part of the galaxy has come to expect from humanity these past 100 years. Diplomatic complaints, formal condemnation, sanctions maybe, if things got serious. Nobody alive today has ever seen humanity actually go to war. Nobody remembers what that looked like, except in old historical records most people don't bother reading anymore." I thought about that, about the strange, quiet confidence I had grown up with, the unspoken belief that humanity's peaceful reputation was simply who we were now, a permanent fact of the galaxy rather than a choice actively maintained. I had never once, in 29 years of life, considered what might happen if that choice were taken away from us. Over the following days, as I slowly recovered enough strength to move around the ward, I began to piece together a fuller picture of what was happening beyond our broken ship. Emma Whitfield, working with whatever fragments of the communication array remained functional, managed to intercept snippets of galactic news broadcasts, each one carrying fragments of a story that seemed to grow larger and more consequential with every passing day. Earth's Unified Council had convened an emergency session within hours of receiving our distress signal. Diplomatic channels between Earth and the Dominion had gone silent, not from Earth's refusal to communicate, but from a strange, deliberate silence that unsettled every analyst trying to interpret it. Several neutral species, including the Velkarai Trade Concord and the Free Colonies of the Ashen Belt, issued formal statements condemning the attack on Compassion's Reach, careful in their wording, clearly unwilling to align fully with either side of what was rapidly becoming an unprecedented crisis. And then, 6 days after the attack, came the broadcast that changed everything. I was in the ward's makeshift common area, helping Toma with a simple puzzle meant to keep the younger children occupied, when Kevin came rushing in, his face pale, gesturing urgently toward the display screen mounted on the far wall. "You need to see this," he said. The screen showed a live feed, grainy from the distance it had traveled, showing what appeared to be an orbital shipyard above Earth, one I did not recognize from any of the peaceful, civilian construction platforms I had seen in documentaries growing up. This shipyard was different. Vast, industrial in a way that felt almost aggressive, its structure bristling with dry docks, each one holding the skeletal frame of something enormous taking shape. A news anchor's voice narrated over the feed, her tone carefully neutral, despite the obvious magnitude of what she was describing. Sources within Earth's Unified Council confirm what independent observers have long suspected, but never been able to verify. Following the Threshold Accords, humanity did not fully decommission its wartime shipbuilding capacity, as was publicly stated at the time. Instead, several orbital shipyards, believed retired for over a century, have remained in a state of dormant maintenance, staffed by a small, dedicated workforce, and are now confirmed to be operating at full capacity for the first time since the end of the First Contact War. I stared at the screen, at the half-formed shapes of warships taking form in the dry docks above Earth, structures that dwarfed anything I had ever seen in civilian use, and I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the ship's damaged environmental systems. "They kept them," I whispered. "This whole time, they kept them ready." "It gets worse," Kevin said quietly, and gestured for the feed to continue. The anchor's voice returned. "In related developments, the Earth Unified Council has formally notified the Dominion government, along with all signatories of the Threshold Accords, that as of this broadcast, humanity considers the Accords broken by Dominion action and reserves all rights previously waived under its terms. This marks the first such declaration made by any signatory species in 107 years. The feed cut to a brief statement from a council representative, a man with tired eyes and a voice that carried none of the fury from the earlier broadcast, only a kind of quiet, terrible resolve. "We did not want this," he said simply. "We built our entire civilization, after the war, around the idea that peace was worth protecting more fiercely than any territory or resource. We kept our promises for over a century because we believed peace was the better path, and we still believe that, for every species willing to honor it alongside us. But peace requires trust from both sides. When that trust is broken, when the vulnerable and the wounded are targeted specifically because someone believed we had become too gentle to respond, we are left with only one answer left to give." He paused, looking directly into the camera, and even through the grainy, distant feed, I felt the weight of his next words settle over the ward like a held breath finally released. "We remember how to fight. We simply chose. For 107 years, not to. That choice has now been taken from us." The feed ended there, and the ward fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the quiet hum of failing life support and the distant sound of Toma's puzzle pieces clicking softly together, oblivious to the full weight of what had just been said. I looked at Kevin, and for the first time since the attack began, I saw something in his expression that was not fear, or grief, or exhaustion. It was something closer to awe, mixed uneasily with a fear of an entirely different kind. Not fear for our safety, but fear of what humanity itself was now capable of unleashing. "They've been sitting on this capacity for a century," I said slowly, trying to process the scale of what I had just seen. "Everyone thought it was gone. Everyone thought we really had become what we presented ourselves as." "Maybe we did become that," Kevin said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly the point. We chose peace, every single day, for over 100 years, even while keeping the ability to do otherwise. That's not the same as forgetting how. That's restraint. And now that restraint is over." I did not know, sitting there in the dim emergency lighting of our broken ship, surrounded by refugees who had survived an attack meant to punish them simply for seeking shelter, what exactly was coming next. But I understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest, that the galaxy I had grown up believing I understood was about to change in ways none of us could fully predict. Somewhere far above Earth, warships that had slept for a century were waking up, and somewhere beyond the edge of our shattered hospital, the Dominion fleet that had attacked us was about to learn exactly what that awakening would mean for them. 2 weeks passed before a rescue convoy finally reached what remained of Compassion's reach. By then we had settled into a grim rhythm of survival, rationing power, rationing food, treating what injuries we could with dwindling supplies, and doing our best to keep the youngest among us distracted from the reality of our situation. Toma had grown attached to me in a way that broke my heart a little more each day, following me through the ward, asking questions I did not always have good answers for. "Why did they attack us?" he asked one evening, as I helped settle him and several other children into their sleeping area. "We didn't do anything wrong." I sat beside him for a long moment before answering, choosing my words as carefully as I could. "Sometimes," I said, "people in power make choices that hurt others who never did anything to deserve it. It isn't fair, and it isn't right, and I don't have a good explanation for you beyond that. But I can promise you this, a lot of people, very far away, are working right now to make sure nothing like this ever happens to another hospital like ours again." He seemed to accept that answer, or at least he was tired enough to stop asking, and I sat with him until his breathing evened out into sleep, my mind still turning over everything I had learned in the days since the attack. The rescue convoy arrived without warning, 3 sleek Earth vessels emerging from slipspace in tight formation, their approach so smooth and controlled that Emma Whitfield, monitoring what remained of our sensor array, barely had time to announce their arrival before they were already establishing a docking connection with our battered hull. I will never forget the sight of the first rescue team stepping aboard our ship, dressed not in the soft blue uniforms of humanitarian workers I was accustomed to, but in the dark, efficient gear of an emergency response corps I had never seen in person before, moving with a precision and calm that immediately steadied something in my chest that had been tense for 2 straight weeks. Their lead officer, a woman named Claire Sutton, found me almost immediately, her expression softening the moment she took in the state of our ward, the exhausted faces, the makeshift medical stations, the children clustered together in whatever comfort they could find. "You held this together," she said simply, looking around at what we had managed to preserve despite everything. "That's not something everyone could have done." "We didn't have a choice," I said. "You always have a choice," Claire replied gently. "You chose to help these people survive instead of simply surviving yourself. That matters more than you probably realize right now." Over the following hours, the rescue teams worked with a speed and coordination that felt almost overwhelming after 2 weeks of scarcity and improvisation. Medical triage began immediately. Refugees and crew alike assessed, stabilized, and prepared for transport to a proper medical facility. I found myself swept up in the process, helping coordinate the movement of patients even as exhaustion pulled at every part of my body, unwilling to rest until I knew everyone under my care had been safely accounted for. It was during a brief pause in the evacuation, standing near what remained of the ward's main entrance, that I finally asked Claire the question that had been building in me since the moment I first saw the recording of Earth's shipyards. "What happens now?" I asked. "To the Dominion, I mean. What is Earth actually going to do?" Claire's expression grew serious, and for a moment, I saw past the composed professionalism to something more personal underneath, a tightness around her eyes that told me she carried her own weight from whatever she had witnessed in the days since the attack. "I'm not authorized to discuss military planning," she said carefully, "but I can tell you what I've seen with my own eyes on the journey out here. Fleet mobilization on a scale nobody currently living has ever witnessed. Every dormant shipyard, active. Every reserve unit, called up. This isn't posturing, Laura. This is preparation for something real." "Do you think it's the right choice?" I asked, surprising myself with the question, unsure why I felt the need to ask someone I had only just met. Claire considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that for 107 years, we told ourselves and everyone else that peace was simply who we had become. And I think what happened to this ship proved that peace, left unguarded, can be mistaken for weakness by those who never truly understood what it cost us to maintain it. I don't know if going to war is the right choice. I know that allowing an attack like this to go unanswered would teach every hostile power in this galaxy that hospitals, refugees, and civilians are acceptable targets whenever it's convenient. I'm not sure humanity can live with that lesson being taught." I thought about Vesa, about the elderly woman whose hand I had held in the dark, about the 11 people we lost when the bulkhead partially failed, about Toma asking why anyone would attack a ship that had done nothing but help. I thought about all of it, and I understood, in a way I had not fully understood before, exactly what Claire meant. The evacuation continued through the following day, and by evening, the last of the refugees, including Toma and his mother, had been transferred safely aboard the rescue convoy, bound for a proper medical facility within Earth-controlled territory. I stayed behind with the small remaining crew of Compassion's Reach, helping secure what could be salvaged from our broken ship before its final tow back towards Sol space for repair, or, more likely, decommission. It was during this final work, sorting through damaged records in what remained of the ship's administrative office, that Captain Cole found me, his face carrying an exhaustion that seemed to have settled permanently into the lines around his eyes. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, "for everything you did during the attack, and in the days after. I know it wasn't easy." "I just did what needed doing," I said, "the same as everyone else." "That's not entirely true," Cole said. "Kevin told me about Toma, about the extra time you took with him, and the other children, keeping them calm when the rest of us barely had the strength to keep ourselves steady. That matters. It matters more than you know." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, and for a moment we stood together in comfortable silence, amid the wreckage of the office, both of us processing, in our own separate ways, everything that had happened. "What will you do now?" I asked eventually, "when we get back to Sol space." Cole was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I've been asked to serve as a liaison officer," he said finally, "attached to the response fleet, being organized under the Unified Council. They want people who understand the medical and humanitarian dimension of what happened here, people who can help ensure that whatever comes next remains focused on accountability, rather than simple retaliation." "Are you going to accept?" I asked. "I already have," he said. and I'd like you to consider joining me, if you're willing." The offer caught me off guard, and I found myself staring at him for a long moment, trying to process what he was actually asking. "You want me on a military response fleet," I said slowly. "I'm a medical liaison. I've never had any interest in anything beyond humanitarian work." "That's exactly why I want you there," Cole said. "Because what's coming needs people who remember why we're doing this in the first place." It would be easy, in the chaos of what's ahead, to lose sight of the fact that this entire response exists because someone attacked a hospital, because someone thought civilians and refugees were acceptable casualties in pursuit of a military objective. I need people beside me who will never let that reason be forgotten, no matter how large this conflict grows. I thought about it for a long moment, standing there amid the wreckage of the ship that had been my home for 3 years, thinking about Vessa's hand gripping mine in the dark, about Toma's small arms wrapped tightly around my neck, about the 11 names Kevin had read aloud during the small memorial service we held before the rescue convoy arrived. "I'll go," I said finally, "but I'm not going as a soldier. I'm going as exactly what I've always been, someone who takes care of people. If that's still useful to you, then I'm in." Cole nodded, something like relief passing briefly across his tired features. "That's exactly what I'm hoping for," he said, "because I think, before this is over, we're going to need people who remember how to be gentle, even in the middle of everything that's coming." 3 days later, aboard a transport vessel bound for Sol space, I stood at a viewport watching the stars stretch into unfamiliar patterns as we entered slip space, my mind still turning over everything that had happened, everything that was still unfolding somewhere far beyond my ability to fully comprehend. Somewhere behind us, the broken hull of Compassion's Reach drifted slowly toward Earth for repairs it might never fully receive. Somewhere ahead of us, an entire species was preparing to remind the galaxy of a truth it had allowed itself to forget. I did not yet know what role I would play in what was coming. I only knew, standing there in the quiet hum of the transport's engines, that I would carry Vessa's grip and Toma's small trembling arms with me into whatever came next, and that I would not let anyone forget why any of this had started in the first place. The transport arrived in Sol space 6 days later, and nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when the viewport finally cleared of slipspace distortion. I had grown up seeing images of Earth's orbital defenses, the same handful of aging platforms that had stood watch for decades, familiar and unchanging, a quiet backdrop to a peaceful civilization. What I saw now was something else entirely. Warships, dozens of them, arranged in vast formations stretching further than my eyes could easily track, their hulls a deep matte gray that seemed to absorb the starlight around them rather than reflect it. Beyond them, orbital shipyards blazed with construction light, more vessels taking shape within their scaffolding, the scale of it all so far beyond anything in my previous experience that I simply stood frozen at the viewport, unable to fully process what I was seeing. "It's a lot to take in," said a voice beside me, and I turned to find Kevin Marsh standing there, having made the same journey I had, having accepted a similar role within the response fleet's medical corps. His expression mirrored what I imagined was on my own face, a mixture of awe and quiet unease. "I didn't know we had this," I said quietly. "None of us knew." "That was the point," Kevin replied. "A century of restraint only works if the restraint is real. If everyone knew exactly how much capability sat waiting in reserve, the peace would have felt like a performance instead of a genuine choice. I think that's part of why this hit people back home so hard. We convinced ourselves, along with everyone else, that we really had become something entirely different." I thought about that as our transport received clearance to dock at one of the massive orbital stations. Thought about the strange comfort I had always taken in believing humanity's peaceful reputation was simply an unchangeable fact rather than a carefully maintained choice. It was a comfort I no longer fully possessed, replaced instead by something more complicated, a mixture of pride and unease that I suspected I would be carrying for a long time. Captain Cole met us at the docking bay, along with a tall woman in a council uniform who introduced herself as Grace Ashford, one of the coordinating officers assigned to the Response Fleet's Civilian Oversight Division. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and assessing in a way that told me she had already reviewed every detail of our records before we ever arrived. "Officer Bennett," she said, Your file mentions you managed to keep over 300 refugees calm and organized during a 2-week survival situation, with minimal resources. That's exactly the kind of experience we need represented within this fleet. I appreciate the confidence, I said, but I still don't fully understand what my role is meant to be here. I'm not a strategist. I'm not a soldier.
That's precisely why we want you, Grace said.
This fleet is being built around a single non-negotiable principle, one that Captain Cole has been instrumental in establishing, alongside the Council's senior leadership. Whatever military action follows will be conducted with absolute discipline regarding civilian protection. We are responding to an attack on a hospital. We will not become the kind of force that commits the same violation we are responding to. That requires people embedded throughout the fleet's command structure, whose entire purpose is to advocate for exactly that principle. In every planning session, every targeting decision, every moment where the pressure of war might tempt someone to cut corners. I absorbed that for a moment, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling onto my shoulders in a way I had not fully anticipated. You want me to be a voice in the room, I said slowly, reminding people why any of this matters in the first place. Exactly that, Grace confirmed. And based on what I've read about how you handled yourself aboard Compassion's Reach, I believe you're exactly the kind of voice this fleet needs. Over the following days, I was integrated into what the Council was calling the Humanitarian Oversight Division, a small but growing group of medical officers, ethicists, and former humanitarian workers, embedded directly within the response fleet's command structure. I met people from every corner of Earth's diverse population, men and women who had spent their careers in medicine, in disaster relief, in diplomatic service, all of them now repurposed toward a singular, unprecedented task, ensuring that humanity's return to war did not compromise the values that had defined its long peace. It was during one of my first briefings, attended by senior fleet commanders and civilian oversight officers alike, that I finally began to understand the true scope of what was being planned. A tactical officer named Oliver Grant, a serious man with a quiet, measured voice, presented an overview of the fleet's strategic doctrine, and I listened with growing understanding as he outlined an approach that differed sharply from anything I had expected. Our objective, Oliver explained, gesturing toward a holographic display showing the Dominion's territorial holdings, is not the destruction of Dominion civilization. It is the dismantling of the specific military capacity responsible for the attack on Compassion's Reach, and the establishment of consequences severe enough to ensure this cannot happen again, to us or to any other vulnerable population within this region of space. How do you separate military capacity from civilian infrastructure in a conflict of this scale? Asked one of the other oversight officers, a woman I had not yet met. Through absolute precision, Oliver replied, and through accepting a slower, more difficult campaign than a less disciplined force might choose to fight. Every target within this operation will be verified through multiple independent intelligence sources before authorization. Every strike will be evaluated by this very oversight division before execution. We are not simply capable of fighting with restraint. We are choosing to build that restraint into the operational structure itself, at every level. I raised my hand, and Oliver nodded toward me, giving me the floor. What happens, I asked, if a strike is authorized, and during execution, civilian presence is detected that wasn't accounted for in the initial planning? The strike is aborted, Oliver said simply, without hesitation. Every single time, without exception. That is not a guideline. It is an absolute standing order, issued directly by the Unified Council, and reinforced by every commander within this fleet. We are not going to war to prove we can match the Dominion's willingness to disregard civilian life. We are going to war to prove that even in conflict, that disregard is a choice we refuse to make. I felt something settle in my chest at those words, a fragile but genuine reassurance that the fleet gathering above Earth was not simply an instrument of vengeance, but something more carefully considered, more deliberately restrained, even as it prepared to unleash a capability the galaxy had not witnessed in over a century. That evening, I found myself standing alone at an observation deck overlooking the vast formation of warships assembled in Earth orbit, watching their running lights blink in slow, coordinated patterns across the darkness. Kevin found me there, carrying 2 cups of the same bitter coffee I remembered from the morning of the attack, an eternity ago now, though it had only been a few weeks. Having second thoughts? He asked, handing me a cup and settling beside me at the railing. Not about whether this needs to happen, I said. About what it means for who we are, going forward. We spent a century convincing the galaxy, and maybe convincing ourselves, that we had moved past this entirely. Now we're proving that we never actually did. We just chose not to use it. Does that change what kind of people we are? Kevin asked. Or does it just reveal what kind of people we've been all along? I thought about that question for a long time, staring out at the assembled fleet, thinking about Vessa's grip in the darkness, about Toma's small trembling arms, about the careful, deliberate restraint Oliver Grant had described in that briefing room, restraint built not from an absence of capability, but from a conscious, continuous choice to wield that capability differently. I think, I said finally, we've always been both things at once, capable of enormous violence and capable of enormous compassion. The peace wasn't a lie. It was a choice we made every single day for 107 years, and I think what's happening now is just another version of that same choice, made under circumstances none of us ever wanted. Kevin nodded slowly, considering that, and for a long while we simply stood together in silence, watching the fleet's lights blink steadily against the darkness of space, waiting for the moment, now rapidly approaching, when that fleet would finally depart Earth orbit and carry humanity's answer across the stars toward the Dominion border. 3 days later, I received formal orders assigning me to the fleet flagship, a vessel called Steadfast Mercy, chosen deliberately, I was told, to carry a name that reflected the fleet's dual purpose, strength enough to answer what had been done to us, and mercy enough to ensure we never became the thing we were fighting against. I packed what little I owned into a single travel case, said a brief goodbye to the handful of colleagues from Compassion's Reach who were not joining the fleet, and boarded a shuttle bound for my new post, carrying with me a quiet, steady resolve that had grown steadily since the moment I first held Toma in the darkness of our dying ship. The galaxy had forgotten, over a century of peace, exactly what humanity was capable of. I did not know, standing in that shuttle bay awaiting departure, whether that forgetting had been a blessing or a mistake. I only knew that within days the galaxy was about to remember, and that I intended to be there, standing at the center of it, making certain that whatever humanity became in the fighting ahead, it never lost sight of the reason the fighting had begun at all. The journey to Dominion space took 11 days, and I spent nearly all of them learning the rhythms of a ship unlike anything I had experienced before. Steadfast Mercy was nothing like Compassion's Reach, where my old ship had been built wide and open, designed for the movement of stretchers and the comfort of the wounded. This vessel was built for speed and precision, its corridors narrower, its crew smaller and more focused. Every system aboard designed around the singular purpose of projecting force with exact, deliberate control. I met the fleet's overall commander, Admiral Sophie Lang, on my 3rd day aboard, during a briefing that would shape everything I understood about the campaign ahead. She was a compact woman, with silver threading through dark hair, her presence carrying an authority that filled the briefing room without her ever needing to raise her voice. "Officer Bennett," she said, greeting me with a brief, firm handshake. "Captain Cole speaks highly of your work aboard Compassion's Reach. I want you to understand exactly why your role in this fleet matters, because I suspect the coming days will test it more than you currently expect." "I understand the Oversight Division's purpose," I said. "Ensuring civilian protection remains central to every decision." "That's the surface of it," Admiral Lang said. "The deeper truth is this. Every person on this fleet remembers exactly why we're here. Nobody aboard this ship has forgotten the images from Compassion's Reach, the casualty reports, the accounts of refugees fleeing violence, only to find it waiting for them in the one place they believed was safe. That memory is a powerful motivator, and it is also a danger. Anger, even righteous anger, can erode discipline if left unchecked. Your role, and the role of everyone in your division, is to be the counterweight to that anger, at every stage of this campaign." I nodded, understanding more fully now the weight of what I had agreed to. Over the following days, I sat in on strategic planning sessions that revealed the true scale of the operation being prepared. The fleet's approach would not be a single overwhelming strike against Dominion territory, but a careful, staged campaign targeting specifically identified military assets, shipyards, weapons depots, and command centers, directly tied to the fleet responsible for the attack on our hospital. Civilian population centers were explicitly excluded from every targeting list, verified and re-verified through layers of intelligence analysis that I found myself continually impressed by, even as the reality of what we were preparing to do settled more heavily with each passing day. We reached the edge of Dominion territory on the 11th day, dropping out of slipspace at the outer boundary of a system called Threnvale, home to one of the Dominion's primary shipbuilding facilities and, according to our intelligence, the staging point for the very battle group that had attacked Compassion's Reach. I stood on the bridge observation deck as the fleet began its approach, watching the tactical display fill with the icons representing Dominion defensive forces gathering to meet us, dozens of warships forming up around the shipyard they had been tasked with protecting. Admiral Lang stood at the center of the bridge, her expression calm and focused, issuing orders in a steady, measured voice that carried no trace of the anger I might have expected, given everything that had brought us here. "Open a channel to the System Defense Command," she said. The channel opened, and a voice filled the bridge, tense and defiant, clearly aware of exactly what fleet had just arrived at their border. "This is Threnvale System Defense Command. You are entering Sovereign Dominion territory in violation of established boundaries. Withdraw immediately or face consequences. This is Admiral Sophie Lang of the Earth Unified Fleet," Admiral Lang replied, her voice level and clear. "Your government's forces attacked a protected hospital vessel, operating under the Threshold Accords, resulting in significant civilian and medical casualties. We are here to address the military capacity responsible for that attack. Civilian population centers within this system are not targets of this operation, and we urge you to ensure your civilian population understands this distinction clearly. Surrender your military assets, or prepare to have them dismantled." There was a long pause before the response came, quieter now, less certain than before. "You expect us to simply surrender our defense fleet?" "I expect you to make a choice," Admiral Lang said. "The same choice your fleet marshal took from 300 refugees and an unarmed medical crew several weeks ago. Unlike him, you actually have one." The channel closed without further response, and moments later, the Dominion Defense Fleet began moving to intercept our approach. What followed was unlike anything I had prepared myself for, even after days of briefings and strategic discussions. I watched from the observation deck as the fleet engaged, and what struck me most was not the scale of the engagement, though it was immense, but the precision of it, the way our forces moved with a coordinated discipline that seemed to systematically neutralize Dominion warships one after another, while leaving the shipyard's civilian support structures and the system's inhabited orbital stations entirely untouched. I watched tactical officers repeatedly abort strike opportunities the moment sensor data suggested any possibility of civilian presence near a target, watched Admiral Lang personally review and reject 3 separate strike proposals during the engagement because the projected outcomes carried even a small risk to non-military structures. It was a kind of restraint I had never imagined possible in the middle of active conflict, restraint maintained, not despite the intensity of the fighting, but woven directly into its very structure. The engagement lasted just under 6 hours. When it ended, the Dominion Defense Fleet at Threnvale had been reduced to a scattered handful of disabled vessels, their crews evacuated by our own forces to holding stations aboard support ships, treated, I later learned, with the same medical care we would have provided our own wounded. The shipyard itself remained intact, its productive capacity permanently disabled through precisely targeted strikes against its military production lines, its civilian population entirely unharmed. I found myself standing beside Admiral Lang as the engagement concluded, watching the tactical display settle into a pattern of green icons representing secured Dominion vessels rather than destroyed ones. "This isn't what I expected war to look like," I admitted. "It's not what anyone expected," Admiral Lang said. "It's not what the Dominion expected, certainly. I suspect Fleet Marshal Rescovai believed that if humanity ever returned to conflict, it would look exactly like the stories told about the First Contact War, indiscriminate, overwhelming, merciless. I think that belief is precisely why he felt safe attacking an unarmed hospital. He assumed either we would do nothing, or that if we did respond, we would simply confirm the old nightmare stories and give his government every justification it needed to rally its own population against us."
And instead, I asked.
Instead, Admiral Lang said, we're proving something more difficult, and I suspect far more unsettling to men like him. That our restraint was never weakness, and our capability was never dependent on abandoning our principles. We can do both. We can answer force with force, and still remain exactly who we say we are. Over the following 2 weeks, the campaign continued along similar lines, striking against 7 additional Dominion military installations directly connected to the attack on Compassion's Reach. Each engagement conducted with the same rigorous discipline, the same careful avoidance of civilian harm, the same insistence on treating captured Dominion personnel with the same medical care and basic dignity we would extend to our own. It was during the 8th engagement, at a heavily fortified command station believed to house Fleet Marshal Rescovai himself, that I finally came face to face with the man whose orders had shattered my ship and killed people I had cared for. He was brought aboard Steadfast Mercy following his surrender, escorted under guard to a secure meeting room, where Admiral Lang had requested I be present, along with Captain Cole, given our direct connection to the attack that had started everything. Rescovai was older than I had expected, his face lined with an exhaustion that seemed to run deeper than the physical toll of recent weeks, his violet-colored eyes carrying an expression I struggled to read, somewhere between defiance and something closer to genuine confusion. I do not understand, he said, once introductions had been made, his translated voice carrying a flatness that failed to fully hide the emotion beneath it. Your fleet has had every opportunity to destroy my facilities entirely, to strike my population centers, to make an example severe enough to ensure no power in this galaxy ever considers testing your resolve again. Instead, you have shown restraint at every turn. Why? Captain Cole was the one who answered, his voice quiet but firm. Because the moment we abandon that restraint, he said, we become indistinguishable from the choice you made when you fired on an unarmed hospital. We are not fighting to prove we can match cruelty with greater cruelty. We are fighting to prove that even in conflict, the values that defined our peace do not simply disappear. Rescovai was silent for a long moment, studying each of us in turn, before his gaze finally settled on me. You were aboard the hospital, he said. It was not a question. I was, I confirmed, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. I carried children to shelter, while your fleet fired on us. I held the hand of a woman who did not survive her injuries, because your attack destroyed the section of our ship, best equipped to treat her. I have not forgotten a single moment of it, and I never will. Then explain to me, Rescovai said, why you are sitting across from me now, showing restraint, rather than demanding my execution as vengeance for what I ordered. I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking about Vesa, about Toma, about the 11 names read aloud during our small memorial service, about everything the past weeks had taught me about the strange, difficult balance between justice and mercy. Because vengeance would only prove your assumptions about us correct, I said finally. You believed that if provoked enough, we would abandon everything we claimed to stand for. I refuse to give you that satisfaction. We are here to hold you accountable for what you did, not to become you in the process. Rescovai said nothing further, but something in his expression shifted, subtly, a crack forming in whatever certainty had carried him through the events of the past weeks, and I understood, watching that shift happen, that this moment mattered as much as any engagement fought across the past 2 weeks of campaign. 6 weeks after the campaign began, representatives of the Dominion government arrived aboard Steadfast Mercy to formally negotiate an end to the conflict. Fleet Marshal Rescovai had already been remanded into council custody, awaiting formal proceedings under the Threshold Accords for his role in the attack that started everything, but the broader negotiations extended far beyond a single man's accountability. They centered on rebuilding the framework of peace that had governed this region of the galaxy for over a century, and ensuring it could never again be tested in the way it had been tested at Compassion's Reach. I was invited to attend the negotiations, not as a voting participant, but as a witness whose presence, Admiral Lang explained, served as a quiet, constant reminder of exactly why the entire campaign had been fought. The Dominion delegation was led by a woman named Elena Vashari, a senior diplomat whose government position had grown considerably following Rescovai's removal from military authority. She carried herself with a careful, measured caution, clearly aware of the weight her government now bore in the eyes of the wider galactic community. "We acknowledge," she said, during the opening session of negotiations, "that the attack on your hospital vessel constituted a severe violation of the Threshold Accords, one that our government failed to prevent and must now account for. We are prepared to accept whatever terms are necessary to restore the framework of peace between our peoples." Admiral Lang, seated across the negotiating table, studied the Dominion delegation for a long moment before responding. "We are not interested in terms designed to punish your people indefinitely," she said. "We are interested in terms that ensure this can never happen again, to us or to any other species relying on the protections that framework provides. That distinction matters a great deal to us." The negotiations that followed spanned nearly 2 weeks, addressing not only formal accountability for the attack itself, but broader reforms to how the Threshold Accords would be enforced going forward. Stronger verification systems for protected medical vessels, clearer consequences for violations, and a renewed commitment from every signatory species to the principles that had maintained peace across this region for over a century. I found myself drawn into these discussions more deeply than I had expected, offering perspective on what protections would have actually made a difference during the attack on Compassion's Reach, what warning systems might have provided more time, what verification protocols might have prevented the Dominion fleet from ever believing an attack could be justified through fabricated claims about insurgent presence. It was during a quieter moment, near the end of the negotiations, that Elena Vashari approached me directly, finding me alone at an observation deck, much like the one where Kevin and I had once watched the fleet assemble above Earth. "I wanted to speak with you personally," she said, "away from the formal proceedings." "Of course," I said, curious, despite the exhaustion that had settled into my bones over weeks of continuous work. "I have read the full account of what happened aboard your ship," she said, "the casualty reports, the survivor testimonies, your own statement given during the negotiations. I want you to know that what happened was never sanctioned at the highest levels of our government. Rescovai acted on his own authority, believing he could achieve a strategic advantage against the insurgency without triggering the kind of response your species ultimately provided. That doesn't undo what happened," I said, not unkindly, but honestly. "No," Elena agreed. "It does not, but I think it matters that you understand this was not the will of an entire civilization, but the choice of one man who badly misjudged what he was risking. Just as I imagine it matters to you that the response we witnessed from your fleet was not simple vengeance, but something far more deliberate." I considered her words for a long moment, thinking about everything the past 2 months had taught me, about the strange, difficult balance between accountability and restraint that had defined every stage of this conflict. "I think," I said finally, "the entire galaxy learned something important these past weeks, including us. We spent a century convincing everyone, including ourselves, that peace was simply who we had become, as though it required nothing further from us beyond maintaining it. What happened proved that peace is never passive. It has to be defended, actively, continuously, by people willing to hold on to its principles, even when everything around them makes that difficult." Elena nodded slowly, and for a moment, we simply stood together in silence, watching the stars beyond the viewport, two people from civilizations that had spent the past century largely avoiding real conversation with one another, finding, in this quiet moment, something that felt very much like genuine understanding. The formal peace agreement was signed 3 days later, aboard a neutral station, chosen specifically for its long history, hosting diplomatic proceedings between multiple galactic powers. I stood among the assembled witnesses, as Admiral Lang and Elena Vashari signed the renewed terms of the Threshold Accords, strengthened now with protections that had not existed before, protections born directly from the lessons of everything we had all endured. 6 months later, I returned to active duty, aboard a rebuilt Compassion's Reach, its hull repaired, its wards restored, its mission unchanged, despite everything that had happened in the months since its destruction. Kevin remained with me, as did Captain Cole, who had accepted a position overseeing the ship's continued operation alongside his broader responsibilities, within the renewed Accord's oversight structure. Toma visited us during the ship's first tour following its return to service, older now by half a year, but still carrying the same stuffed animal he had clutched so tightly during the darkest hours of the attack, his mother accompanying him with a warmth in her expression that told me she had finally found some measure of peace following everything her family had endured. "You kept your promise," Toma said, finding me in the same recovery ward where I had first carried him to safety all those months ago. "You said people were working to make sure this never happened again." "I did say that," I agreed, kneeling down to his level the way I had during that terrifying evacuation. Though this time, there was no alarm, no darkness, only the quiet, steady hum of a ship functioning exactly as it was always meant to. "Did it work?" he asked. "Are we safe now?" I thought carefully about how to answer, remembering everything Claire Sutton had told me during the rescue, everything Admiral Lang had taught me during the campaign, everything I had learned about the difficult, continuous work required to maintain something as fragile and essential as peace. "Safety isn't something that just happens once and then stays forever," I told him. "It's something people have to choose to protect, again and again, every single day. But yes, Toma, right now you are safe, and there are a lot of people, on Earth and beyond, who are going to keep working hard to make sure that stays true." He seemed satisfied with that answer, offering me a small, genuine smile before running off to rejoin his mother, and I stood there for a long moment in the quiet ward, thinking about everything the past year had taught me about my own species, about the strange, complicated truth that peace and strength were never truly opposites, but two expressions of the same deep, careful choice, made and remade, every single day, by people willing to hold on to what mattered most, even when the cost of doing so proved higher than anyone had ever expected. The galaxy had spent a century believing humanity's peace was simply the absence of war. I understood now, standing in that rebuilt ward, surrounded by the quiet sounds of healing rather than the alarms of destruction, that our peace had always been something far more deliberate than that. It was a promise, actively kept, by people who understood exactly what breaking it would cost, and chose, every single day, to keep it anyway. And when that promise was finally broken, not by us, but against us, we had answered not with the nightmare the galaxy remembered from a century past, but with something more difficult, more disciplined, and ultimately more true to who we had always chosen to be. We remembered how to fight. We simply chose, for as long as we possibly could, not to. And when that choice was finally taken from us, we made certain the galaxy understood exactly why it had mattered so much in the first place.